There's something really strange about money. You might be earning more than before, more stable than before, but somehow, inside, things don't feel any lighter. You still think before spending. You still hesitate a little before buying something you don't truly need. And there's this vague feeling, like things could shift at any moment. What's interesting is that feeling doesn't come from not having enough money. It comes from something deeper, something most people have never really looked at directly. I've noticed a pattern that shows up in a lot of people. They're not poor, they're not in a financial crisis either, but in their minds, there's always this background layer of thinking about money. A simple example, you open your bank account and the balance looks fine. But right after that, you start doing mental calculations. How many expenses are left this month? What if something unexpected happens? Am I being a little too loose with my spending? No one is forcing you to think this way, but you still do. Automatically. Most people don't realize this isn't really about the numbers. It's about how your brain is interpreting money. Main idea. 1. Financial insecurity doesn't come from how much you have. It comes from not knowing how long it will last. I've realized something that a lot of people can't quite put into words. You're not actually worried about how much money you have today. You're worried about how long that money can keep you safe. Two people can have the exact same amount in their bank account, but one feels relatively calm, while the other constantly feels a subtle tension. The difference isn't the number. It's this quiet question in the background. If everything stopped, how long could I last? A very real example. Someone earns a steady income every month. Their expenses aren't that high, but they still feel the need to stay in control. Not because something is wrong right now, but because in their mind, there's no clear picture of the future. They don't know if their income disappeared, how long they could manage. And when the brain doesn't have a clear answer, it automatically shifts into defense mode. Cut back, hesitate, double check, prepare for the worst. What's interesting is that feeling of something's not quite right isn't because you're doing anything wrong. It's because you don't have a clear endpoint in your mind for financial safety. And when there's no endpoint, every number feels like it's not enough. That's why a lot of people increase their income, but their feelings don't change because they've only changed the amount of money, not the way they measure security. And when the measurement doesn't change, the emotional result doesn't change either. The takeaway: you're not actually lacking money. You're lacking a clear boundary that tells you this is enough. Main idea 2. Financial pressure doesn't come from what you've spent. It comes from what you've quietly committed to maintaining. I've noticed something very subtle, but it has a huge impact on how you feel about money. Financial pressure rarely shows up right when you spend. It shows up later, slowly, and almost invisibly. For example, you start a new habit, not because you need it, but because it makes life a little more comfortable. A convenient service, a way to save time, a small lifestyle upgrade. At first, it feels harmless. You're still in control. Everything still feels fine. But here's the interesting part. Your brain doesn't register it as an expense. It registers it as a new standard. And from that moment on, you're no longer comparing to your old baseline. You're comparing to the new one you just created. Most people don't realize the pressure they feel doesn't come from what they've spent. It comes from what they now have to keep spending just to maintain things as they are. That's the dangerous part. Because a one-time expense leads to not a big deal, but a recurring standard leads to becomes a psychological obligation. And that obligation, it doesn't show up on a bill. It lives in your head. Another simple example. You get used to a certain way of living for a few months. Nothing extreme, just a little more comfortable. Then one day, you try going back to your old level. You don't lose money, but it feels uncomfortable, not because you need it, but because you've gotten used to it. And that familiarity turns a choice into pressure. What's interesting is, the biggest financial pressure doesn't come from overspending. It comes from building a life you no longer want to downgrade from. And from that point on, your financial decisions start to feel constrained. You're no longer choosing freely. You're just trying to maintain. The takeaway: You're not stressed by what you bought. You're stressed by what you've gotten used to. Main idea 3. The more you try to control money, the more out of control it feels. I've noticed a paradox that a lot of people fall into. While believing they're good with money, they track everything. They log expenses. They compare every detail. They think carefully before every decision. It sounds responsible, but what's interesting is the more they do this, the more unstable money starts to feel. Not because they're doing something wrong, but because their approach keeps the brain in a constant state of alert. A very simple example, you open your banking app not because you need to do anything, just to check. You scroll through your transactions. Nothing unusual, but afterward, you still feel slightly uneasy, a subtle feeling, but enough to trigger thoughts like, am I spending too much? Is there anything I should cut back on? Most people don't realize, when you constantly check your money, you're sending your brain a very clear signal, something's not okay. And your brain doesn't know whether you're checking out of habit or because there's real danger. It only knows one thing, you're worried. And when you repeat that behavior every day, you're training yourself into a financial state. Always tense, always cautious, always ready to cut back. What's interesting is, people who feel calm about money aren't people who ignore it. They still track things. But they don't track to find problems. They track to confirm their system is working. It's a small difference, but it changes everything. One side, controlling every action. The other, trusting a system you've built. And when you shift from controlling every expense to trusting your overall structure, your financial feeling starts to change. Not because you have more money, but because you're no longer holding everything together with willpower every single day. The takeaway, you're not tired because of money. You're tired because you have to constantly watch over it. Main idea 4. The problem isn't how much you earn. It's that you don't know when you're actually making progress. I've noticed something really subtle, but it makes a lot of people feel like they're just standing still. They're still working, still earning. In fact, probably doing better than before, but internally, nothing really changes. They still feel like it's not enough, still don't feel secure, still feel like they haven't really moved forward. What's interesting is, this has nothing to do with how much you earn. It comes from the fact that you don't have a clear way to recognize that you're on the right path. Most people don't realize your brain needs signals of progress. If it doesn't see those signals, it assumes you're not moving. A very real example, you've been working consistently for months, no major problems, everything feels fine. But because there's no clear milestone, no real system to measure progress, all your brain registers is normal. And over time, normal starts to feel like no progress. So you begin to question, am I actually moving forward? Am I missing something? And that doubt creates pressure. Not external pressure, but pressure from not being able to see your own progress. What's interesting is, a lot of people have come a long way. They just don't feel it, because they don't have internal markers to recognize it. They only look at the present and compare it to some vague standard in their head. Unclear, no endpoint. And when you compare yourself to something vague, you'll always feel like you're not there yet. The takeaway, you're not lacking progress. You're lacking a way to see it. Main idea 5. The feeling of not enough doesn't come from lacking. It comes from constantly comparing yourself to a moving target. I've realized something most people overlook. You're not actually comparing yourself to other people. You're comparing yourself to a standard in your head that keeps shifting. And that is why you never feel like it's enough. A simple example, when you were earning less, you thought, if I just get to this level, I'll be fine. But once you actually get there, you don't stop. You raise the bar. Naturally, you start thinking, maybe just a little more, maybe I need more stability, maybe I need to feel more secure. What's interesting is, no one is forcing you to do that. Your brain does it automatically because it's always trying to create a wider safety zone. But here's the problem. That safety zone doesn't stay still. It moves with you. Most people don't realize when your standard keeps rising, the feeling of enough keeps moving further away, not because you're not progressing, but because you changed the finish line without realizing it. And when this repeats over time, you end up in a strange place. You have more than before, but you don't feel better. You've achieved more, but you don't feel like you've arrived. What's interesting is, this isn't really a financial problem. It's a psychological mechanism, one that keeps you moving forward, but never lets you stop and feel it. And if you don't recognize it, you'll keep running without knowing what you're actually chasing. The takeaway: you don't lack money to feel enough. You lack a stopping point to acknowledge what you already have. Main idea 6. Feeling stable might be the very thing that makes you lose control. I've noticed a pretty surprising pattern. Most major financial drift doesn't start when things go wrong. It starts when things feel fine, no big problems, steady income, spending under control, and that feeling of everything's okay lowers your level of attention. A very real example: when your account is just enough to get by, you're very careful. You think before spending. You evaluate everything. But when you start having a bit more, you don't think as much. You make decisions faster. You double-check less. You question things less. Not because you're careless, but because you feel like you don't need to be that alert anymore. Most people don't realize this slight comfort is exactly when their financial system starts drifting without them noticing. No big mistake happens, just small decisions becoming easier. And when those small decisions stack up, they slowly reshape your entire financial structure. What's interesting is, by the time you feel like something is off, it's already been happening long enough to become your new normal. And at that point, going back isn't as easy. That's why a lot of people don't see any problem at first, but after a while, they think, I don't know why money doesn't feel the same anymore. No shock, no obvious mistake, just a very slow process that started from feeling I'm doing fine now. The takeaway: the fastest way to lose control of your finances isn't a crisis. It's the feeling that you no longer need to stay in control. Main idea 7. What drains you about money isn't earning it. It's having to constantly decide what to do with it. I've realized something a lot of people misunderstand. They think they're tired because making money is hard. But in reality, they're tired because they have to think about money too many times a day. Not big decisions, just small ones, repeated over and over. A simple example: nothing special happens in your day, but in your head, there are still these small questions. Should I buy this? Is this really necessary? Would it be better to wait until next month? Each question is small, but every time you answer it, you spend mental energy. Most people don't realize money doesn't just take your money. It takes your attention and decision-making energy. And when the number of decisions gets too high, you enter a very specific state. You don't want to think anymore, so you choose the easiest option. Either just spend it and move on, or avoid deciding at all. Neither one is about discipline. It's about decision fatigue. What's interesting is, people who feel light around money aren't people who don't make decisions. They just don't make them constantly. They've turned most of those choices into defaults. They know clearly what's always okay, what doesn't need thinking, what's never an option. And when the number of decisions drops, your financial state starts to feel lighter, not because you're richer, but because you're no longer burning energy on every small choice. The takeaway: you're not tired because money is hard. You're tired because you have to think about it too often. Main idea 8. You don't actually spend based on needs. You spend based on the emotional state you want to maintain. I've noticed something really interesting. Most of your spending doesn't come from clear needs. It comes from something more subtle, the emotional state you want to hold on to. A simple example: there are days when you feel good, work flows, everything feels aligned, and you spend a little, not because you need it, but because you want to extend that feeling. On the other hand, there are times when you feel tired, a little stressed, low energy, and you spend again, not to buy something important, but to escape how you feel right now. Most people don't realize money is being used as a tool to regulate emotions, not to solve needs. What's interesting is both of these are completely normal in small amounts. Nothing wrong with them. The problem starts when you don't realize you're doing it. Because when you don't see it, you assume every expense is logical, when in reality, the real reason is emotional, and emotion are constantly changing. This creates a loop that's hard to notice. You feel something leads to you spend. You spend leads to your state changes. Your state changes leads to you spend again differently. And over time, money stops being a tool that serves you. It becomes a way to manage your internal state. What's interesting is people who are good with money aren't people who never spend emotionally. They just notice when it's happening. And once they notice, there's a small pause, a very small gap, but enough to not get pulled in. The takeaway: you don't spend because you need to. You spend because you want to feel something. Main idea 9. You don't actually want more money. You want to think about money less. I've realized something a lot of people say without fully understanding it. They say, I want to make more money. Sounds logical. But if you look closer, what they really want isn't money. It's the state where they don't have to think about money all the time. A simple example: when you imagine having more money, you're not thinking about buying more things. You're thinking about not having to overthink small expenses, not constantly checking your account, not stressing over unexpected costs. What's interesting is your mental picture of being richer isn't about money. It's about mental ease. Most people don't realize they're chasing money as a way to escape psychological pressure. But here's the problem. If the way you think about money doesn't change, then even when you have more, you carry the same patterns with you, just at a bigger scale. You used to worry about small amounts. Later, you worry about bigger ones. You used to check because you feared not having enough. Later, you check because you fear losing it. What's interesting is the anxiety doesn't disappear. It just changes form. That's why some people reach the level they once dreamed of and still don't feel light, because they gained money but never changed their relationship with it. The takeaway: you don't really want more money. You want a state where money doesn't take up so much space in your mind. I've come to a very clear realization after watching so many people. Our problem with money rarely comes from money itself. It comes from how we don't know when enough is enough, don't know how far we've come, don't see the invisible pressure we create, and don't understand why we always feel not quite okay. What's interesting is, once you start seeing these things more clearly, you don't need to earn more right away. You don't need to change your whole life. You just need to understand your financial feeling doesn't come from the number. It comes from how you interpret that number in your mind. And when that interpretation changes, your feeling changes, not because you have more, but because you finally understand what's really going on with your money, calmly, clearly. If any part of this felt like it was describing you, hit like. And if you want to understand more about how money really works in the human mind, subscribe. I'll keep sharing the things most people feel, but have never been able to put into words.